Monster Hunter Wilds is due out at the end of the month, and in anticipation for that moment, Capcom have released a benchmark tool so that you can see exactly how your hardware is going to perform before buying the game. Now obviously, I'd always advise against pre-ordering or pre-purchasing a game unless you're getting something dramatically amazing on top of the base game for doing that, because, well, it's not uncommon for games to come riddled with bugs and glitches on day one. So at least you can see exactly how things will perform before that day. Now, with any new game come the developer recommended specs, which give us information on what hardware you'd need to run it, and what you're likely to get from that, ranging from minimum specs to recommended specs, all the way through to ultra specs. But we've taken it one step further, as with a little tweaking, I think we can get more performance than what they claim. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
Oi oi, I hear you're in the market for a proper top-of-the-line monitor. Best blacks, brightest whites, sharper than a tailor's crease, am I right?
Yeah, that's the one.
Well, look no further, my son. Feast your peepers on this, the Glare 5000, a true marvel of technology. Just, maybe don't use it when the sun's out.
What? That's not what I want. I was after a 32-inch 4K 165Hz QD OLED with adaptive sync.
Core blimey, we've got a right tech connoisseur here. You don't mess about, do you? All right. I see where you're coming from. Forget the Glare Master, that was just a warm-up. What you need, my friend, is the Aegon Pro AG326UD from AOC. Top tier gear, 4K, 165Hz, QD OLED, all the bells and whistles. And get this, HDR 400 certified. That's the real deal, no mucking about.
That does sound good.
Of course it does. I wouldn't steer you wrong, would I? I'm all about quality, me. Now, if you want to get your hands on one of these beauties, you know what to do. To find out more, click the link in the description below. You won't regret it, my son. Lovely jubbly.
So let's talk about the specs, because they're, well, a bit iffy. When we look at the minimum specs, they recommend a few processors, and due to the fact that more consumers, at least in a retail sense, bought the Ryzen 5 3600, we've built a system centered around that, along with a GeForce GTX 1660 6GB or Radeon RX 5500 XT 8GB card, likely due to the 4GB model suffering due to its lackluster VRAM capacity. We decided to plump for the Radeon model as we'll be using NVIDIA cards for the other tests that we're doing today. Now, Capcom claim that with this hardware, you'll be good for 1080p at 30fps on low settings, with upscaling set to 720p, so essentially running at 66.6% render scale, which means we're operating on quality mode. Now, the iffy part comes down to the recommended specs, as they list the same CPUs, but with either an RTX 2060 Super 8GB or Radeon RX 6600 8GB. Again, we're starting to see a bit of a pattern with memory capacities essentially alienating older, lower tier cards. For this one, we went with the RTX 2060 Super, as the game does have ray tracing, so if you wanted to dabble there, then there's kind of something for you, though that will obviously take a hit in performance numbers. What's interesting though is how they claim 1080p at 60fps on medium settings with FrameGen, which, as we know, DLSS FrameGen isn't actually available on the RTX 2060 Super. So instead, we are looking at utilising FSR's own version of FrameGen. So it's going to be interesting to kind of see how that plays out, even on an NVIDIA card. Then there's Ultra, which the game did start development before the RTX 50 series were announced or launched, so I wasn't expecting them to include anything for them. But they do claim on the Ultra tier that you need an Intel Core i5 11600K, i5 12400, Ryzen 7 5800X, or Ryzen 7 7700. So with that being kind of the top tier they recommend, we've actually taken it one step further and plumped for a Ryzen 7 9800X 3D. GPU-wise, they recommend an RTX 4070 Ti, Ti Super, or 7800 XT from AMD. So again, we're going actually pretty balls to the walls and have gone with the RTX 5090. But don't worry, we won't just be showing you how it performs, but instead we'll be talking through getting the very best performance from it while not sacrificing on visual quality. Now, what they do claim is 4K at 60fps with FrameGen enabled using the Ultra preset. But I think due to the combo that we're using, we can get quite a lot more without FrameGen. And then we can look at what FrameGen can actually bring to the table. So for our testing, we have two systems running, well, very different combos. The first is a system with the AMD Ryzen 5 3600 non-X with 32GB of Kingston Fury Renegade 3600MHz CL16 memory on a Gigabyte X570S Aorus Master. While the other system is our GPU benchmarking system with an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X 3D and 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB 6000MHz CL30 memory on a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master. Now, both systems have the latest BIOS versions, latest Windows 11 updates, and of course, we're using the latest relevant drivers. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting things off with the minimum specs, which call for a Ryzen 5 3600 and a Radeon RX 5500 XT, a GPU that wasn't exactly famed for its popularity. And that's kind of part of the reason why we chose it over the Nvidia counterpart, to see if it can still keep up in 2025. It's here where we see performance sitting around the 30 to 40 FPS point, depending on the scene. Now, what we found interesting about this is, well, this is pretty much the performance that we were promised in the spec sheet, but their figures were using upscaling. So, well, that raised the question, what happens if we now enable it? As you'd expect, we do see a performance increase, but well, it's only minor, and we see pretty much the same frame rate, give or take 5 FPS here and there. In more open areas, we see lower performance, but what is nice to see is that having a monster on screen doesn't really seem to make a difference to the frame rate, which, well, would have been a bit of a killer for a game called Monster Hunter, but it's all good. Now, something that I did notice between both of these runs was that despite the frame rate dropping below 30 FPS at points, it wasn't really that big of a deal, and remained relatively smooth looking. And from playing the beta, I can confirm that this frame rate doesn't really make a huge difference, and we were happily playing around 40 FPS in the beta without even realising. Now, what is nice to see with this game is that it features a lot of modern upscaling tech without going overboard and making it dependent on it. And since this game features both DLSS frame generation and FSR's own version, you actually get options no matter what GPU you're using, within a degree. So when we enable frame generation, even on this older card, we do see the frame rate now averaging at around 56 FPS, which is pretty close to 60, and still extremely playable. Now, there are drops down to 40 FPS and peaks that go up to around 77 when in less intensive areas, but generally we see just under 60 frames per second. What is nice is that if you have hardware maybe a little lower tier than this, then you could still probably get a playable frame rate using frame generation, even if it does only sit around the 30 FPS point, as that, well, should be enough to happily play the game. Now, something that I have to wonder though is, why do they suggest a 30 FPS minimum on this hardware when adding frame generation doubles the frame rate? But maybe it's the visuals that will suffer. And that's where we switch to talking about the visuals, and on the lowest quality preset with no upscaling at 1080p, the gameplay does exhibit several noticeable graphic compromises. Skin textures appear soft and smudgy, lacking the finer detail that brings characters to life. Fine textures such as strands of hair are particularly challenging for the game to render at this setting, so instead of individual strands you'll often see a scattered smattering of pixels, which overall diminishes the realism. Large objects such as rock formations or monsters display spotty textures rather than smooth, consistent patterns, which further highlights the limitations of this preset. Now, the game does struggle during fast-moving action sequences, and well, the combination of a lower frame rate and reduced visual fidelity results in a somewhat juddery motion, making combat and quick camera pans just feel less fluid and more disorientating. However, the game performs best in stationary scenes, especially when objects are positioned far in the distance. The lack of detail becomes less noticeable at a distance too, allowing the overall composition and atmosphere of the world to remain somewhat intact. In these moments, the visual shortcomings are less distracting, offering a more cohesive experience despite the lower settings. Then, when we switch to having upscaling enabled, the visuals remain, well, largely unchanged and still suffer from the same errors in texture representation. Skin textures continue to appear soft and smudgy, and fine textures like strands of hair still struggle to render properly. The slightly increased frame rate offers some benefit during fast-moving action sequences, making motion feel just a bit smoother. However, the improvement isn't substantial enough to eliminate judder completely. Frame generation, while further boosting frame rate, makes the already poor fine textures even worse in motion. For example, hair, which already appears as scattered pixels when stationary, becomes even messier during movement, with more random pixels appearing around the texture and reducing clarity. Now, one noticeable improvement is with environmental effects. The dust, which previously flickered distractingly, now appears more stable. However, this comes at a cost of persistent graininess, so there's definitely a trade-off for visuals and performance. Moving on to the next combo, which is keeping the Ryzen 3600 processor, but this time we're pairing it with the RTX 2060 Super, as suggested in the recommended section of the spec sheet. Here we find the frame rate pretty close to where they advertise, averaging around 40 FPS without any form of upscaling. Now, this preset does suggest using frame generation, however, so it's not all too surprising that with no upscaling at all, we do fall under the 60 FPS that we're meant to see. Then, when we look at upscaling, we actually see the frame rate falling a little under what they advertise, with an average of around 50 FPS. Now, this is obviously depending on the current scene, and we do see points where it sits pretty comfortably around 60 frames per second. But when we take the drops into consideration, it'd be unfair to say that this is a smooth 60 FPS experience. So where does that leave us? Well, to try and improve the frame rate, we can always drop the preset from medium to low, and this should be enough to see us sitting above 60 throughout gameplay. But for those who don't want to do that, there is again frame generation. Now, with frame generation, we see the frame rate go up to an average around 70 FPS. So what you could do here is either take advantage of the higher FPS and increase settings to get a better looking game, or you could still choose to drop the settings down to low or even lowest to see a much smoother frame rate. But, well, for a game like this, you don't really need those super high frame rates, as, well, this is a franchise that many people are used to playing on Nintendo consoles after all. Now, in terms of the visuals, we do see a clear improvement, offering much more detail than lower presets, though still not perfect. Environmental textures that were once flat are improved. Solid colours now have more visible detail, such as the grain in the wood and natural contours on the ground, just overall look better. Fine objects like grass are now rendered as discrete individual elements, replacing the previous pixelated effect. And while there's no noticeable improvement, some issues do remain though. The dust effects still flicker due to the lower frame rate. Hair pixelation has been mostly fixed, but motion still remains juddery, especially during camera movements. Textures are sharper than on lower presets, but again they still lack the depth and crispness seen in higher quality settings, giving them a softer appearance overall. With DLSS enabled, the game benefits from a near 60 FPS frame rate, which does offer much smoother motion overall, but things like fine hair, which had previously been fixed, now return to a grainy pixelated texture, though this issue isn't as noticeable with grass. At this resolution, it's hard to really distinguish between DLSS and native resolution, as the improvements in sharpness are subtle, but I think if you're really looking for it, you can tell the difference. Then, with frame generation enabled, the story remains largely the same. The frame rate improves, offering smoother motion, but the issues with fine textures in motion, including hair and grass, is exacerbated. These details become more pixelated and grainy again, particularly during fast movement, and considering that these settings aren't particularly sharp to begin with, adding frame generation and DLSS doesn't degrade the already imperfect image significantly. In fact, the benefits of the extra frames make it a worthwhile trade-off, providing a smoother and more responsive experience without noticeably worsening the visual quality too much. Lastly, just for fun, we wanted to see what could be achieved with a 9800X3D and RTX 5090, as we can then completely trick out the settings to try and get the very best performance to see how far we can push the game. It's here where at 4K we end up seeing frame rates sitting around the 90 FPS mark for a lot of the run, which is pretty impressive given that ray tracing is enabled. But when we turn ray tracing off, we don't see that big of an improvement, with pretty much the same level of performance. But we do see the highs going into the triple digits at points, but never really for that long. We do begin to wonder though if the inclusion of ray tracing is really doing much if we only see a small increase in performance, so we'll just have to compare the visuals as well. Performance at this point is pretty impressive, so upscaling isn't really needed. But what happens if we enable it? Well, we figured that if you're running a system like this, you're probably going to go all out with upscaling or not use it at all. So we've skipped looking at upscaling alone and instead are jumping straight into adding frame generation. It's here where we see the frame rate almost double, comfortably sitting over the 144Hz refresh rate of our 4K monitor. So this was a pretty good experience overall. Now, something else we wanted to see was what kind of performance we saw with the same settings, but without ray tracing enabled. Because if the boost is big enough, then why enable it? What we weren't expecting was to see the frame rate increase being, well, marginal, with the final frame rate ending up just averaging over 6 FPS higher. Now, with a frame rate difference this small, the question then doesn't really come down to performance and instead comes down to the visuals. On these settings, the game delivers a striking level of visual fidelity. Micro skin details such as pores and freckles are rendered with exceptional clarity, extended even to intricate features like the irises of characters' eyes. Fine textures ranging from fabric weaves to individual strands of hair are now sharply defined, contributing to the realism and the high frame rate, consistently above 80 FPS, and that ensures that these details move fluidly, whether during exploration or fast-paced combat. Shadows are particularly impressive as they maintain the underlying surface details instead of appearing as flat black patches. This then adds depth and realism to shaded areas, further enhancing the all-important immersion. Dense environments like foliage-rich areas benefit greatly from the interplay of light and shadow, and textures across materials are highly detailed, such as leather surfaces showing rich, warm detailing, and wooden textures now displaying natural grain and imperfections, which again adds to the world's authentic lived-in feel. With ray tracing enabled, the visual experience at 4K Ultra remains largely similar to the non-ray tracing version, though there are subtle improvements. Ray tracing adds a slight increase in contrast, particularly in lighting, enhancing the depth of shadows and providing more detail in darker areas. For reflective materials like armour or glasses, it does offer faint highlights, but the reflections themselves remain fairly simple, with glasses still showing bright spots rather than complex details. Water reflections see minor improvements with more defined light ripples, but overall the effect is still understated and doesn't drastically alter the visual experience. With frame generation and DLSS enabled, the stunning visual experience remains free from noticeable artifacts while significantly improving smoothness. Fine textures like grass, for example, lose clarity during swaying motions, becoming kind of blurred and lacking detail, and then similarly textures such as sand become less defined during fast movement, which again reduces the level of detail and overall immersion. On the positive side, motion is much smoother with upscaling and frame generation enabled, as character animations in particular are notably more fluid, enhancing the overall sense of responsiveness and overall realism. And this smoother motion does apply to both combat and exploration, making for just, a more enjoyable and seamless experience that balances performance and visuals in a kind of nice compromising way. So testing 3 different GPUs gave us kind of a great look at how the game scales across different hardware. While Capcom's recommended specs provide a rough estimate of what to expect, as we've seen, there's often more to the story than what's actually on paper. The benchmark tool is a pretty useful thing for gauging performance before the launch, but with a bit of tweaking like we did today, it is possible to squeeze out more performance or enhance visuals depending on your specific setup. Some settings are more demanding than expected, but with the flexibility of upscaling and frame generation, players have plenty of options to fine-tune their experience. Now, the RX 5500 XT struggled in some areas, but still managed to deliver a playable experience at 1080p with the right adjustments. The fact that it could hit around 30 to 40 FPS without upscaling shows that Capcom's spec sheet was actually fairly accurate, though the minimal kind of improvement when enabling upscaling was, a bit surprising. Now, FrameGen helped push that closer to 60 FPS, making gameplay significantly smoother, though, as expected, there were some noticeable visual compromises. That said, given that this is the type of game that many users are used to playing on lower-end hardware, such as a Nintendo Switch, performance at this level is still pretty decent, especially for older hardware like this. Then, as we move up to the RTX 2060 Super, we did see a solid jump in performance, but Capcom's claim of 60 FPS on medium settings didn't quite hold up without upscaling. Instead, the game hovered closer to 50 FPS, with FrameGen pushing it beyond 70. This type of setup, I kind of feel like it gives players the choice of either using medium settings with smoother frame rates or pushing visuals kind of higher while relying on frame generation to keep the gameplay fluid. The impact of upscaling was more than noticeable here compared to the RX 5500 XT. And while fine detail still suffered, the overall improvements in stability and performance, in my opinion, made it a very worthwhile trade-off. Then, at the high end, the RTX 5090. It delivered by far the best experience, as you'd expect, sitting comfortably at 90 FPS at 4K Ultra with ray tracing enabled. Interestingly, disabling ray tracing didn't really provide much of a performance boost, which raises a question of how much of a difference it actually makes in the game. The implementation appears relatively subtle, with only minor improvements in contrast and reflections. Now, enabling both FrameGen and DLSS helped to push the frame rate above 144Hz, which did make for an incredibly smooth experience, and this was without significant visual degradation. While motion artifacts were still present in fast-moving textures like grass and sand, the overall fidelity remained pretty damn impressive. Ultimately, Monster Hunter Wilds has strong scalability and is able to balance visual quality and performance across a wide range of hardware. While the official specs provide, a good baseline, our testing shows that FrameGen and upscaling can make an even bigger difference than expected, especially for mid-range and older GPUs. The flexibility in settings also allow players to adjust performance to their liking, whether that means prioritizing smooth gameplay or increasing visual fidelity. With a little tweaking, even lower-end systems can achieve a stable and enjoyable experience, making this game one of the more, accessible AAA releases in recent years. So there you have it. That's going to wrap this one up. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can help support everything that we do, along with getting a ton of cool added extras by joining the super special secret Patreon club. You'll get access to exclusive behind the scenes content, access to a lot of our testing data, bi-weekly game nights, and so much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.